Hi, everyone. Thanks for tuning in to another episode of the All Things Interesting podcast, where I sit down with individuals across a variety of different backgrounds to share their stories and the interesting things that they do. It is my hope to share all that is out there to my audience, whether it be providing a different perspective, sharing unique stories, helping you become a better version of yourself, or giving insight into the interesting things out there. I got you covered. If you enjoyed the episode or any of the past episodes, follow me on Instagram and Twitter at Tesher Cohen and subscribe to the All Things Interesting podcast on YouTube, iTunes, Spotify, Google Play, or any of your favorite streaming platforms. On this episode, I sit down and talk with a consultant, trainer, and professional negotiator with over 30 years of experience in skill negotiation. He authored the book Skill Negotiation with the goal of helping you avoid the decades of hard work he put into learning to be a skilled negotiator by sharing his personal lessons to achieve your business and personal goals. Without further ado, please welcome my guest, James Johnson. Okay, wow. That's Presley got this resolved, yeah.
Well, hey, we're not done yet.
I know, we're not out
the
of
power
the
could go out again. So.
Yeah, let's knock on wood that doesn't happen. So
that was a tree last week, and it was 1,000 houses in our area. And anyway, bad luck. So
yeah, it's kind of crazy. It's sunny out, all of a sudden your power goes out. That's kind of random.
It is, absolutely. So, but that was I don't know, I sent you a link to I hope you looked at it.
It's not a big deal. I'm just like, wow, that's so weird. Usually power goes out during a storm, but not during when it's sunny out. So.
No, it was just there's a lot of old trees in the area, and I guess some of them came down. But it's just incredibly bad luck because it was right before we're supposed to talk. So
yeah, that's all right. It happens. But anyway, here we
are.
Right.
This actually works now.
Yeah. So okay. Yeah, here we are. James Johnson, author, consultant, professional negotiator. Let's just kick things off. What's a bit of your background? Tell me how you became a professional negotiator. I'm a bit interested in this because, again, as I mentioned during our previous recording attempt, I was kind of surprised because a negotiator is usually associated with being, a cop who negotiates crime crises, or being in a corporate situation where they're negotiating acquisitions. So what is it exactly that you do as a professional negotiator, and what is your history?
Sure. My history's fairly straightforward. Well, maybe not. I graduated from university back in the mid-'80s in the midst of a recession, and I honestly couldn't get a job. So the only job I could get was selling office equipment, photocopiers and computer equipment and fax machines. And I'm so old that fax machines were a new thing back then. The difficulty I had in selling them was convincing people that they needed them or what they were, because it was so new that people didn't even know how to use a fax machine. And now, of course, fax machines are ancient technology. So as I started as a salesperson dealing with primarily smaller companies, but also larger ones as well. And I realized really early in my career that if I was a better negotiator, then I got better deals and my income went up. And that's when I started sort of 30 years ago. And I realized at that point that becoming a better negotiator was a real benefit to me personally and also in my business life with respect to income. So from there, I have maintained over the course of 30 years, any job I've done has been negotiation heavy. Normally it's contracts for and on behalf of corporations. Right now I work for, or it's my primary gig is working for a very large corporation in Canada. It's about a $4 billion a year annual revenue. And what I do for them is I really coach people who do the negotiations. I don't normally negotiate too much directly anymore unless it's a really important contract. And the contracts primarily are not always about money, but almost at least part of it will always be about money. And so I coach people who coach other people how to negotiate now.
So, one of the things that kind of stuck out from what you just said, going back to the faxing example in the 80s, you mentioned that you were dealing directly with sales. Is there, would you say there's a direct relationship between negotiation and sales? Is that an interchangeable term that people could use?
I would say not. I think sales is negotiation is part of sales for sure, but I would say it's aside from sort of structuring the conversation in a sales environment. Um, Sales is a lot about convincing people of the need or the value of your product or service, and negotiation is certainly part of that. But it really comes in at the end of it. So I would say negotiation is a subset of sales, but it is, I think, the most important part because that's really where all the difference comes. It's not that it's easy to sell something. I know from bitter experience from 30 years ago that it's not always easy. Um, but if you're talking about selling something for the least amount you can or selling it for more and earning more income for yourself or your company, then negotiation is really where all the benefit comes from.
So, when did you tell that you had the skills necessary to become a negotiator? Or, in other words, when was the moment you realized you were meant to be a professional negotiator, so to speak?
Right. I being a good negotiator or a skilled negotiator is something that it does not an on off switch. It's something you work at, and I think that's something that many people just miss. It's There's a perception out there amongst almost everybody that being a good negotiator is a natural skill, and some people are good at it and others aren't, and that is just not true. Being a skilled negotiator is a matter of effort and study, and recognizing when you've made a mistake and recognizing when others are successful and emulating them. So there's no one time where I sort of the light switch went off and I said, "Hey, now I'm a negotiator." It was just something that gradually developed over the course of honestly decades, where I just got better and better at it, and I still learn every day. As I say, I coach others who coach others to negotiate, and even 3 steps removed. If it comes to it, we're hiring lawyers, and so I may be 4 steps removed from an actual negotiation. But I, as much as I teach others, I learn from them as well, and it's a daily journey to get better.
Is it something that you would say you learned more so from reading up on or applying directly in real world experiences over the course of your career?
It's mostly learning from my direct experiences and learning from others. I certainly have done a lot of reading over the course of my career with respect to negotiation. Not too many negotiation books themselves. Honestly, a lot of them they say the same things. And but if you look elsewhere with respect to behavioral economics and other studies, really, and strategy and game theory, there's a lot of things to learn there that apply to negotiation.
So that brings me to my next point, actually, on the topic of reading, because you wrote a book called Skill Negotiation, in which you cover different facets of the study of negotiation, how to be a better negotiator. Could you go a bit into that?
Yeah, absolutely. The odd thing is I didn't really intend to write a book. As I say, I started in the business world in the mid '80s, and I realized and I learned pretty early that being a good negotiator had a significant effect on my life and my business success. And so I started studying it at that point. But it wasn't just studying books. It was looking to see what my peers and at that point my superiors were doing at the time, and I learned from them. So right from the beginning, or maybe 6 months or a year into my career, I started making notes on how to be a better negotiator, and I would jot down sort of tips and tricks that I learned, and it quickly became just one page. And then over the course of literally decades, I've added to it and edited it, and eventually I came up with this what effectively was a book. It was 40 something words long. At that point, it was in a Word document. Um, and realizing maybe 10 or 15 years ago that I had what was essentially a book, because it included chapters and long paragraphs and links to scientific and other studies and other information. I took a look at it and went, well, I've spent decades sort of learning this on my own. It would be worthwhile to clean it up and try and share it with others, so they didn't have to go through the decades of struggle that I had.
Right. And you pointed out that it's a compilation of your history of notes from when you started your career, or at least early on from your career into recent time. What would you say has changed from your notes when you first started to now? Do you ever look back on any of that information and see it differently?
I have to admit I don't no longer have any of my original notes. It started as a pen on a piece of paper, and then it went to a Word document. It might not have been Word at the time. It might have been Word Perfect, which was that's how old it is. Word Perfect was the preeminent Word document back when I started it. So I don't have any of those. But what I do recall is they were all. It started as really just one sentence tips, right? Things to remind me. Make sure you set a negotiation range or a target, or one of the things I learned early in a sales training course I took, which was to give a forced alternative, which is a sales technique, but it also works in negotiation. So these are the kind of things I recall writing, and then over the course of decades, it certainly became much more complex.
So just going back real quick, you mentioned a forced alternative. Is that correct? What is that exactly?
It's a sales technique, and I'm not sure I put it in my book. I did one version of my book. I had it, and it was, if you want someone to make a decision, you give them two options, which is, hey, do you want the blue one or the red one? So what you're asking them is not, do you want to buy my product or not? You're saying, would you like the blue of my product or the red of my product? And that's the question you want answered. And once they answer it, you've made the sale. So it does apply to negotiation as well. It's a little hokey and a little basic, but you certainly could do that in negotiation. Let's say you're a contractor and you're trying to finalize a negotiation on a kitchen renovation. You could say to your client, hey, do you want me to start next month, or do you want me to start right after Christmas? That's negotiation, right? You've got someone to come to an agreement. So the funny thing is, I'll give you a story. At the time I was selling, I said photocopiers, and the one guy I was working with sort of took that red or blue example to heart, and he made a sale on that basis. But the problem was we didn't have a red or blue photocopier, and he panicked a little bit. He wasn't necessarily the smartest guy in the world, and there was one little white label on the photocopier, and he colored it in blue because that was his way to sort of justify the question he asked. But it works.
Right, right. Is there a lot of psychological basis behind a lot of these negotiation tactics and sales tactics that you're pointing out to?
Yeah, there really is, and I think I mentioned in my book, and I think maybe I already have, that behavioral economics is really the basis for a lot of my negotiation philosophy, and that is really just how people make decisions that are maybe a little unexpected. So let me give an example. So there's if you're, let's say you want to come to an agreement on some sort of contract. Most contracts have many different aspects to it. You may be agreeing on or negotiating on 6 or 7 different subsets of a contract. One of the great ways to negotiate is to give up really early something that isn't important to you. So you give up early on A. But what you do when you give up on something early is you make it obvious that you're giving your negotiation partner something they want, and just psychologically people have to reciprocate, right? And so if you give up on something that is not important to you early, you're much more likely to get something, a concession from your negotiation partner later on that may be important to you. And so it's behavioral economics. It's most of it's just human nature, but really putting a label to it and deliberately making these decisions creates much more success in negotiation than would otherwise be the case.
Yeah, and I think when I learned about negotiation during some of my schooling and into my early career was that the best form of negotiation is to set different boundaries for what it is that you must have, things that you could possibly do without that can be negotiated, and things that you're willing to give up. So it gives both parties the ability to get the necessary things that make it seem like a success for them, while also being able to fairly give up things that could accommodate the other person to make it not feel as if it's a total failure. Would you say that's kind of a correct statement?
I would, yes, and that's the comments you're making are really valuable because what they are saying is that you spend a lot of time in advance of the negotiation before you sit down, thinking about what you need out of the negotiation, what your negotiation partner would need out of the negotiation, and really just how to bridge that gap. And I think that's the real success in negotiation is not sitting at a table across from somebody else. That's where all the glory is, but all the real hard work happens before that. And that's when people are successful in negotiation is when they do the work ahead of time.
For anybody that reads your book, who would you say it's specifically geared towards, and what are some of the topics that the book covers?
Sure, it's my book is geared to anybody that doesn't negotiate at all or hasn't negotiated much, because it covers a lot of topics that someone who's brand new to negotiation would need. But it also is really valuable for people who are experienced negotiators. My view or my experience with people who think of themselves as skilled negotiators is that they are really good at a fairly small number of skills around negotiation, but they're not they don't have the kind of repertoire that really allows them to be successful in a wide variety of situations, or maybe not as successful as they would otherwise be.
Is there anything specific from the book that you would say stands out that people who don't negotiate or are currently negotiators that would be very helpful to them, or something that might stick out as very beneficial?
Yeah, the aside from I have number of early chapters, three or four that are a bit of a preamble in the book. They're valuable and they need to be there. For sure, I think the readers will learn from them. There are things that might not otherwise be in negotiation books, but the first sort of core negotiation topic I talk about is BATNA, which is best alternative to negotiated agreement. And I think if there was one skill that anyone needed to have, it would be getting a good BATNA.
Not to go too deep into the
Yeah,
topic, because I want to be able to save it for readers to actually get into the book and understand it for themselves. But
right.
just at a high level, what is BATNA exactly?
Sure. And so BATNA, as again, is best alternative to negotiated agreement. There's a very famous negotiation book, maybe the most famous one, called Getting to Yes. A guy named Roger Fisher and Bill Ury, Ury. I'm not actually too sure to pronounce it. It was they were the first people to come up with it, and it's a universal negotiation strategy now. And this is a strategy where you don't want to go to negotiation needing to get a deal, right? So what you want is to go to negotiation where if you don't get the deal you're trying to negotiate there, you've got an alternative that is almost as good. And so that's the goal of a BATNA is and this is again when we talk about prep work, is you want, before you go into negotiation, you want to be able to walk away from that if you don't get the deal you want. And that's much harder to do if you don't have an alternative. And it's a core negotiation skill, but it really is important.
So this kind of segues into my next question, actually. Um, anytime someone goes into a negotiation, they more or less likely ask themselves or question themselves, what are some things that I need to prepare for, or am I underprepared? Am I overprepared? I don't know what the other person's thinking or what they're bringing to the negotiation table. What do you think are some of the biggest challenges when it comes to negotiation in general?
We talked about preparation, and if you're not prepared going into negotiation, let's be frank about it. If you're going out to buy a pair of shoes from some retail worker, you're not going to negotiate. But if you're going to buy a car, or you're going to talk to your boss about getting vacation time or a raise, then that warrants some preparation. I
Mm-hmm.
think the biggest challenge people have with respect to negotiations is they just don't have the confidence that they actually can negotiate. I hear a lot from people I coach, but also people who have already read my book, that most people are afraid to negotiate because they don't know what they're doing. They're afraid of being taken advantage of, and they're afraid of looking stupid.
Mm-hmm.
But the problem is, if you're not negotiating, you are going to be taken advantage of, and so you need to develop those skills and the confidence to apply them.
Would you say that's the biggest mistake that people make with negotiation? Is it that they lack confidence or trust themselves to be able to walk into that room not only prepared, but able to demand what it is that they want?
Um, yes and no. I think the biggest mistake is lack of preparation and lack of confidence in the position they're taking. Um, um, but if you do the work ahead of time, then that you do have that confidence.
Mm-hmm.
So, and having that prep work and having here's what I need out of this negotiation, here's the things I could give up, here's when I might want to give them up, here's what I think my negotiation partner wants out of this, here's how I think, here's the things they might want to give up, here's how we might bridge that gap. If you have those thoughts ahead of time, then you're much more likely to be successful, because you have a plan. And honestly, most people, even like people who think they're really good negotiators, aren't. They maybe have a few things they do well, but if you work at it, you study it, you could be much better than virtually anyone else, because
Mm-hmm.
most people don't even try.
Right. And now, at least from my perspective, I've been in situations where I had to go in and negotiate for a different position. And I've spoken to friends on that same topic. And usually it comes down to, in terms of preparation, going in with a subset of documents or supporting material to show why is it that you deserve that raise? Why is it that you deserve that promotion? Or what is it that you bring to the table that is going to not just bolster your position in terms of getting what it is that you want. In terms of preparation, is that something you would say outside of the general understanding what you're willing to give up, what it is that you must have? Would you say that's also very important to do?
I would, and most people. I think the biggest mistake people make with negotiating is focusing over much on what they want out of a discussion and out of an agreement, and not enough on what your negotiation partner wants. If you're going in to talk to your boss about a raise, she may have some views on your skills, or your part in the company and future in the company that you may not. It may not be about money. It could be about other things, and without sitting down ahead of time and spending some time thinking about what your negotiation partner wants, you may be really talking at cross purposes, and you could come to an agreement fairly easily if you talk the same language or talked about the same issues. But if you're only focused on getting a $10 an hour raise, and your boss is focused on increasing your skill level so that you can be promoted to the next job, if you're both talking about your future in the company, but you're really talking about different things, then it's harder to come to an agreement. And setting the stage for successful negotiation really comes to really setting the agenda. What are that you and your negotiation partner there to discuss? What do you hope to get out of it at the end? And once you come to an agreement on the what you think the end state should look like, the discussion is much easier, and you're much more likely to succeed.
Mm-hmm. And that kind of brings about the idea of not being on the same page or having a different viewpoint on that negotiation. So, for example, the individual might come in at a entry level skill position and they might want a raise or a promotion or something else, and then the boss, for example, may not see that individual as being highly qualified enough to get that raise or to get that new position, or whether it be PT or something else. How would you recommend somebody go into a position of negotiating when they have less leverage? So someone that's in an entry level position, not highly qualified, but is kind of teetering on that promotion, so to speak.
Right. Less leverage is an interesting way to put this. Anytime you go to negotiation, you have less or more leverage than the person you're negotiating with. And sometimes just that could just be perception, right? If you're a junior at a company and you think you have less leverage because you're a junior, you may have all kinds of leverage because you're particularly good at what you do, and your boss sees potential in you, and you are somewhat irreplaceable. But the real crux of having less leverage, the other way to say that is you have fewer options, right? So if you've got less leverage, you've got fewer options than the person you're negotiating with. And so the way to be successful is to create more options for yourself. And we talked about BATNA before, best alternative to negotiated agreement. And that really is the way to avoid not having leverage. You create options so that you've got, if you're not successful in a negotiation you're involved in now, you can walk away and take a different offer that will satisfy you.
Do you think that could work against you though? Do you think that could work for against you in the sense that, say, you're negotiating a raise and you go out and get three other offers from different companies.
Right.
They might not satisfy you, but they're moderate offers. You go to your company, you tell them this is how much you want. You have three other offers, and they tell you to go take a hike. Isn't that something that could work against the individual?
It absolutely could. And we're talking about a fairly distinct situation. We're talking about a junior employee at a company. The value of a BATNA in the vast majority of cases is that you don't really care, right? If you don't get a deal with the individual or company you're talking to today, then you can go out tomorrow and get another. But what I'm not suggesting is that some junior account manager somewhere goes to his boss and says, "Hey, you better give me $5 as an hour raise because I got $4.50 from Joe Smith down the street." Yeah, you're very likely about to get walked, right? So you've demonstrated quite a lack of commitment to your current employer. But that doesn't mean that cannot be successful even for Joe Junior Accountant. He doesn't have to say, "I've got an offer of $4.50 down the street," but he can negotiate from a position where he knows he's got that offer, so he doesn't have to accept $2 an hour or some future promise of a raise at some indistinct point in the future. If he doesn't get what he wants, he knows he has an alternative, and he's much more likely to get $5 from his boss today if he knows he can leave and get $4.50 from someone else. What he's not going to do is get the best deal from his boss if he doesn't have an alternative. So,
at least from what I can tell, having that alternative in place builds that individual's confidence because they know there's a backup plan in the event that it doesn't work out for them at the negotiation table.
That's absolutely the case, right? Is you are much less likely to get an agreement that you want if you don't have an alternative, because you just don't have any choices then, right? You're the victim of whatever your negotiation partner is willing to offer you because you don't have any way to say no to them. So people just need a core of successful negotiation is before you go in to talk to the person you want to make a deal with, is you have an alternative already in place.
So let's dive a little bit deeper into the conceptual aspects of negotiation. How would you define effective negotiating and communicating? This question's a bit vague, of course, so just answer it in any way you feel.
Okay. Well, I think we step back a bit and just go, what is negotiation? So negotiation is really coming to an agreement with your negotiation partner that meets both your needs and the needs of your negotiation partner. And it really has to be fair to the person you're dealing with. It fundamentally comes down to no one negotiates if there's no disagreement. or meeting of the minds. So when you're negotiating, you have to take into consideration the needs of your negotiation partner as well. So, and again, I say it has to be fair. So, and I in my book, I emphasize this as well. One of the perceptions of a skilled negotiator is that they get everything they can from someone else. They're a bit of a bully with respect to negotiation. They will, and I've talked to these people endlessly, and it's tiring, where they'll say, "Hey, I made this deal with this company or this individual, and I can't believe what great a deal I got. I got so much from them, and I got so little in return, or I had to pay so little in return." And that is just the wrong way to view negotiation. First, I think it's really wrong to take advantage of people, and that can happen if you're a skilled negotiator and you're dealing with someone who isn't. It's easy to get more from a deal than is fair, and that just should never happen. So, if I can keep going, there's the other problem with not getting a fair deal or trying to get too good a deal is it often will backfire. And what will happen is that if you force someone into a position where they only have the option of saying no to you or getting something they think is unfair, even if it will hurt them, they will often say no to you just to punish you.
Isn't that, to me, it seems like that's very much like a power trip, much like someone who's in a position of power. They know they have the necessary skills or abilities to oppress someone in some certain way, so they take advantage of the situation by doing so. And to add to that, if we look at the current trade war between China and the U.S., we see Donald Trump kind of use that same impetus with China in terms of negotiating a further trade deal. Would you say that's a good way of putting it?
Yeah, I would. I'm not too sure who I'm going to offend, but I'm no real fan of Donald Trump. And I don't really see much evidence that he's a skilled negotiator, honestly. It's he uses a couple of strategies fairly routinely, and I have them both in my book because I think they are useful negotiation strategies. The problem is they really should not be used that often because they destroy relationships and destroy trust. And when you're the president of the United States, I think you should not. Your negotiations should not reflect a worldview where you are taking advantage of others. It works over the short term, but over the long term, particularly in international politics and trade, I think it really will have a detrimental effect.
You mentioned that it destroys relationships and
Right.
it kind of hinders that growth. Is it possible to walk back or to repair relationships that were kind of broken during the phase of negotiations?
Um, Sorry, I'm pausing because I'm trying to think of a time when when I've been in that situation. The thing about trust is it's hard to create and hard to generate, and once it's lost, it's really hard to recover from. So I guess I'm not saying it's impossible, but you could lose the trust of a negotiation partner in a minute and take years before you will get that back, and maybe never, honestly. So it doesn't mean people won't still deal with you, because sometimes in relationships, business, personal, international trade, there's just no choice. You have to continue dealing with your negotiation partner, but trust matters because it makes it easier over the long term to come to an agreement.
On the topic of international trade, and just to keep it very general this time
Right.
around without any political aspects involved to it, how would you say it's kind of best to pave the road when you're already in a position where it's not necessarily hostile, but you're both on unfriendly terms at that point due to a disagreement with the current deal?
Right. Well, every negotiation is, in some respects, a little hostile, right? If there weren't disagreements, then there would be no need for negotiation. So it's but there's ways to manage that negotiation, and I really view it this way: is in any negotiation where I'm sitting down or really coaching others to sit down across the table from someone. Um, some of the disagreements that exist, they are legitimate. People have firm views on the rightness of their position, and sometimes they're fairly emotionally connected to those views, and disagreeing with them becomes a problem, becomes a barrier to an agreement because they view any disagreement as an attack on them,
Mm-hmm.
or their intelligence, or their legitimacy of their position. And I try and coach people to depersonalize this a little bit. So rather than saying, hey, negotiation partner, I know you want $1,000 a widget for this part, but I don't think it's worth $1,000. I think it's only worth $600, and that's all I'm willing to pay. Well, if your negotiation partner is fully committed to $1,000 and he's got real reasons for it, then it becomes that disagreement becomes a barrier to getting a negotiated agreement. And so the way around it is really just sort of is to recharacterize that dispute between $600 and $1,000 as I'm at 600 and you're 1,000, and you're wrong. To say something like, and I'm paraphrasing grossly, is we both want us to come to an agreement, and we are not aligned with respect to the cost. So let's talk about the cost and how we can work on that, rather than I'm going to tell you you're wrong and you're going to tell me I'm wrong. The idea is to create that difference in costs and create that as a problem that we're both trying to settle, as opposed to uh, the actual issue and dispute. So it becomes a common problem as opposed to a problem that you have with me or I have with
Right.
you.
I think there's a lot of parallels between general negotiation and being in a relationship with somebody. I'm not sure if you've ever heard of the book Men Are From Mars, Women Are From Venus, but it touches upon a lot of the ideas of how men and women communicate with one another as it pertains to arguments or discussions about certain topics. And one of the things that you pointed out that's interesting was that you need to look at the issue not me versus you, but us versus the problem. And that's a common thing I would say I've noticed in arguments or even just general negotiations as it pertains to work or personal life. It's people tend to argue against one another as opposed to focusing their attention together on that specific issue.
Yeah, I haven't read the book. I've been married for 29 years now, and but I think what I've heard of the book and your description is pretty accurate, right? Is we really want disagreements between any individuals, husband and wife, or business partners, or anyone negotiating, to be a disagreement that is non-personal, and that it's a common problem to resolve. So, and I think really what that comes down to is really listening to people, and understanding what they're saying, and listening, not just at a courtesy, so you get your turn to talk, but listening so that you really understand and ask follow up questions, and restating so that the person you're dealing with, either it's your wife or a business partner, or anyone you're negotiating with, they really feel that their view is understood. And I've seen many times where just having your negotiation partner feel that their view is understood uh, will allow for an agreement. And
Mm-hmm.
your negotiation partner won't necessarily get everything they want. And in fact, if they feel that they're understood, they may very quickly give up on things that they've been intransigent in to that point, just because they feel that being understood and still not getting what they want, it's because that it's not possible, not because you don't believe them or just haven't heard them.
Yeah, it's interesting because going back to your definition of effective negotiation and communication, I think listening to a person and making sure that they're really understood is a critical and key part of any form of negotiation. It's, the nonverbal aspect where you're, nodding, you're smiling, you're actually paying attention to the person, you're reiterating what it is they say, not verbatim, but how you perceive they are saying it to show understanding. And even though it might not lead to an agreement, it shows that you are intently listening and care about what it is that they're saying and what it is that they want.
No, absolutely. It's not every time you sit down at the negotiation table where you come to an agreement, but your reputation matters, right? It's a rare thing where you're going to be dealing with one person once, never again, at least not in the business world. And even if it was only one time, if you treat the other person fairly, then they will your reputation will precede you the next time. So, and aside from that, honestly, uh, the world is a difficult place for lots of people, and even if you don't come to an agreement in a negotiation, if it's that non-agreement is done in a pleasant way, then the world's a better place because of it, right? And I think we just have an all responsibility to make the world a better place whenever we can.
Going back to part of my initial part of the conversation, I mentioned that there are various forms of negotiation, whether it be uh, working in politics, working in business, being in relationships, being a negotiator for law enforcement. What would you say is the biggest common denominator across negotiating?
Um, I think it really is about disagreement, right? There's no need for negotiation until there's disagreement. So if there's not disagreement, then there's you're not negotiating. So being a successful negotiator means managing those disagreements, and you manage them by being very clear about where the disagreements are, narrowing them, and the disagreements can be really simple, right? So I'm dealing with a supplier, and I need a product by Friday, and the supplier says I can't get it to you until next Thursday. Well, that's a disagreement, and if you react in a hostile way or a belligerent way or in being a bully, you're really not going to get your way. So managing disagreements in a non-hostile way, coming to some common understanding of where the disagreements come from, and then working towards an agreement. As we said earlier, it's not a me and the other person issue. It's me and the other person dealing jointly with this problem. Then we're much more likely to get an agreement.
And you mentioned that it's about finding that common issue or disagreement to focus on. What are some forms of miscommunication that could lead to that?
I think most disagreements on negotiation are about miscommunication, right, or lack of understanding. And we've talked already about the importance of listening and asking follow-up questions and restating, and those are all really important, but they're not particularly useful unless you mean it. So when you're negotiating with someone else, it's important that you put a lot of effort into understanding the other person's position. So, and what I found in negotiation, and it's borne out by lots of behavioral economics studies, is that people have a definitely bias to the present situation. So people will negotiate on the basis that they like the status quo, or if they're selling something, a service or a product, they value that service or product much more than is really objectively true. And so the negotiation isn't necessarily about what is the real value of X. It's about coming to an agreement about the value of X when one party values it much more than is really objective. So
Right.
even it's funny. There's people really do value what they own more than they should, and even this goes to monkeys. There's a study by the guy's name is Brosnan or Bosnan, I can't remember. He spent a lot of time with chimpanzees, and behavioral economics is just studies are just replete with examples and experiments on monkeys. But in this particular case, he or she he established first that the monkeys preferred peanut butter over apple juice, and I apologize for the simpleness of the example, but it bears fruit in the end. And so monkeys prefer peanut butter over apple juice. Great. But if you give a monkey apple juice first and then you ask to trade the apple juice for peanut butter, virtually none of the monkeys will do that. And that doesn't make any sense at all because we know they prefer peanut butter. And right? So, but people are much the same way. Is they prefer what they own already or their current situation more than some alternative, and even if it doesn't make any sense logically. So a lot of negotiation is really just talking through that issue so that people become comfortable with it. And once you've done that and you address that problem, then you can come to an agreement. But it also applies to me as well, right? I'm not immune to the monkey brain, and something I own becomes more valuable to me than it really should be, and that really impairs my ability to come to an agreement that I might otherwise come to, simply because I don't really think about these issues as objectively as I should.
Right. And I think one of the key things that sticks out from that is that humans are inherently creatures of habit. We become so used to our behaviors, what it is that we have, that it becomes difficult for us to see things in a different light or to change our perspective on things, which in turn hinders our ability to negotiate or to communicate or even to see other people's perspectives, which ultimately brings about hurdles to the negotiation process.
Yeah, I agree entirely. It's so much of negotiation isn't about the ultimate agreement, right? If we had the ability to make our best offer in a negotiation, knowing that if it wasn't accepted, we wouldn't have impaired our ability to make a secondary offer, it would be a lot easier to come to agreement if everyone was perfectly honest and upfront. One of the geniuses of the Uri book, Getting to Yes, is he and his partner spent a lot of time talking about interest-based negotiations, which is not talking about dollars or cents or positions, but talking about how each partner what they want out of a negotiation. And once there's a common agreement and a common understanding on the interests of each person in a negotiation, an agreement itself becomes much easier, because it's just easier to come to an agreement if what you're working on is satisfying your needs, but also your negotiation partner needs. There's often no conflict in those if you and your negotiation partner have the confidence and the willingness to be open with respect to what you want out of it.
I want to circle back real quick to one of our earlier conversations in terms of Donald Trump, specifically to his book, The Art of the Deal. It's a very well-known book, and in a sense is his claim to fame as a businessman. What are your thoughts on that book, as well as its effective methodology?
Sure. I apologize. I can't really speak to Art of the Deal itself. I having not read it, but I would love to talk about his negotiation skills or events with respect to his political career and since becoming president. It seems to me he uses really two different strategies, at least he has, with respect to his international negotiations. They're both in my book. The one I'm not too sure what other people call it, quite honestly. I call it the madman strategy. And this is really, and I've used this and it works. It's where you stick to position without trying to justify it, because there may not necessarily be a legitimate justification for it, and you don't try and defend it. So, I noticed earlier on in Trump's presidency, he used this really effectively with European NATO countries, where he very belligerently said, hey, if you don't spend more money on defense, I'm going to withdraw with NATO, or at least threaten to withdraw from NATO. And that's madness, right? That I don't think even he meant it. But what he did is, by taking this position and ignoring some of the nuances of the finances between European countries and America and how they spend money, he really did get his way, All right, he got Europe to agree to spend more money on defense because he took a position that was really intransigent and insisted they do it. And then the other thing he does is I call it another strategy is called I call it the Godfather rule, and it's probably called something else by others. And it's if you remember the Godfather, it was Don Corleone says, "Hey, I'm going to make an offer that can't refuse." And in negotiation parlance, and this really is valuable, but again, it does destroy trust and damage relationships. Is if you make the status quo unpleasant enough that people will come to the negotiation table because they really don't have any choice, then you can get an agreement that might not otherwise be the case. And I see Trump doing this with respect to China right now. He's raised all these tariffs to the point where the status quo is no longer all that comfortable for China, and perhaps there'll be a new trade agreement out of it. So the other thing he's done is, and I think this really is valuable, is in my book I call it "How to Succeed Before You Start," and Trump tried this with Justin Trudeau on the NAFTA negotiations, and at one point he said, "Hey, there's no point in coming to Washington to talk about NAFTA unless you agree to A, B, and C," and that works. It didn't work in that case, but it often works, and those three strategies have their place for sure. But the first two are things that I think should be used sparingly for sure.
You mentioned that these, in a sense, are somewhat oppressive strategies, in the sense of they play hardball. There's no two ways about it. It's either my way or the highway. Do you think that these are effective long-term strategies? And what are some ways that people should negotiate when the other individual is using these specific methodologies?
Right. They work on one-offs, and they work often when there's a huge power imbalance. So, but what they do on top of that is they really do damage relationships. So I not that they shouldn't be used ever. I've got them in my book. I think they're worthwhile, but they definitely should be used sparingly. And I think if you're on the other end of that, I would just not play ball. Right. So if we talk about the Mad Men strategy, where Trump was, really browbeating Europe into spending more money, well, it wouldn't be hard to manage that and I think this is really what Europe has done, is they've really promised to do more without really doing it. So, and if you're in a position of power and you know that your negotiation partner needs a deal from you that you don't need, we talked about leverage earlier, that is the perfect time to be benevolent, because in being benevolent, you create loyalty and a relationship that is long lasting, and that is really important over the long term, because no one or very few people negotiate just once with another person. But being benevolent when you don't have to be, and I'm not saying that you should not get what you want out of negotiation, but even from a position of power, you should not get a deal that is unfair to your negotiation partner. That's just wrong from a human level, but it's also wrong from a long-term success level.
So let's just say, in theory, he were to get another 2 years in office. Do you think that this shifts the power of balance too much in one direction, or do you think this kind of offsets the trajectory for future trade relations in the future in a negative light?
My one of my underlying or undergraduate degrees was in political science. The other was in English, but I don't pretend to be an expert, frankly, in either now. But America under Trump could get trade deals with China or the new NAFTA deal that are unnecessarily or unfairly beneficial to America, although I don't see that's happened yet. And so they do. They're successful over the short term. But over the long term, it creates problems because Trump may not get the kind of cooperation or trust from his negotiation partners in the future than he might get in the past. Honestly, he's the president of the United States, and the United States is the most powerful country in the world, the most important country in the world. He's de facto got this enormous advantage in negotiating that others don't. But that doesn't mean he's going to get the best deal for America in the future that he could get had there been a more of a situation where there was trust from his negotiation partners. He's always going to be successful, just by the nature of the position he's in and the power of America. But that's not necessarily the most successful he could be over the long term. So trust and goodwill is incredibly important in every negotiation.
To circle things up to the top, what would you say are your top 3 tips when it comes to being an effective negotiator? And these tips could be from your book, Effective Negotiating. It could be from your own personal experiences or things that you've seen in general.
Sure. Okay. We talked about a lot of topics already, either obliquely or directly. I guess if there were a few more things I'd talk about and I'd want your listeners to know, and these are fairly distinct, but they're important. One is anchoring. The anchoring is in a negotiation who makes the first offer, and I know it's fairly universally accepted that anchoring is the proper negotiation strategy, and I agree with it. So if you look at what anchoring really means, it's if I'm making an offer in negotiation, becomes the sort of default agreement, and then both myself and my negotiation partner are starting from that point and then moving from it. And there's behavioral economics has got great insight into this, and I'll just give you a couple examples if I could. There's been studies where they put a bunch of people in a room and they ask them to write down the last 2 digits of their social insurance number. And then they pull out a bottle of wine and say, hey, how much do you think this bottle of wine's worth? And people who have a higher social insurance number, at least the last 2 digits, estimate that bottle of wine as being more valuable than it is. So, or, other examples where different scientists, they spun a carnival wheel and the number came up. And the higher that number on the carnival wheel really affected the participants' estimate of how many nations there were in Africa. And there's just dozens of examples of this. And the thing is the last 2 digits of your social insurance number have nothing to do with the bottle of wine, but it creates an anchor. Even though it people would argue against the reality of it and say that they weren't subject to it, they really are. Anchoring is incredibly valuable with respect to negotiation because you're setting the default position with respect to the value of something, and then you work from there. So if I'm talking about and educating or coaching someone on a negotiation, I insist that they set an anchor. It's just an incredible negotiation tool.
Just a follow-up question to that. Let's just say someone's negotiating a salary increase. Mm-hmm. What if they start by anchoring with an offer that in reality is much lower than the opposite individual on the other side, or the individual on the other side of the table was initially thinking about?
Right. Yeah. And this, we've talked about this before, and it's true. If you don't know enough to make a first offer and an appropriate anchor, then you have no business being in that negotiation. And this all comes down to prep work. So if, I'm going into or I'm counseling someone in a negotiation for a salary, I want them to set an anchor that's above what their negotiation partner is likely to see as appropriate, but not so unreasonable they're offended, right? Because again, we get down to the point where if you're treating someone unfairly, they generally react poorly to it. So if you don't know enough to make a first offer and set an anchor that succeeds or accomplishes your goals, then you shouldn't be there to begin with.
I think it'd also be important to know your worth in that situation, not in an oblivious, over the moon sort of way where you're going into the negotiation room and setting your value 10 times your actual worth, but going in there with a value that you know is supported by your backup material, the work you've done when presenting it to your counterpart. I think that's a mistake, at least from what I could tell, that people make more often than not.
Yeah, I agree entirely. So, and I've not in the last 15 or maybe even 20 years negotiated directly with the same people and over again because as I said, I mostly coach other people now. But years ago, I used to do that, and these people who would view themselves as great negotiators just weren't. They would try and set an anchor, but it was always sort of an empty promise. Is you pretty well knew whatever first number they came up with is you could eventually get them to agree to half of it or a third of it. It depended on who the individual was, and it's because they didn't put any effort into it and they didn't put any thought into it. They didn't view negotiation as anything other than a parlor trick where just doing one or two things is going to work, and that's just not the case, right? Negotiation, and to be successful at it, genuinely takes work. So, and all the fun stuff is sitting across from someone else at a boardroom table, but all the success comes from everything that happens before then.
That's very well put in the sense that it's a skill of its own that every individual should be empowered to learn and to master throughout their career, whatever it is that they may be pursuing. That said, before we go, I wanted to close things up with a final question, and that is, what is a single piece of advice, article, book, or film that you would recommend to your listeners out there?
Sure. Well, I'm going to plug my book, Skilled Negotiation, and you can go to the skillednegotiation.com or email me at skillednegotiation@gmail. It's on Amazon. I think it's pretty amazing, but honestly, it's not just about my book. I really believe that becoming a skilled negotiator will have a dramatically positive effect on your listeners' quality of life and their ability to succeed, right? And think about the average American makes $900 a week, and if they could save $1,000 on a car, that's just about the equivalent of getting a 6-week salary, right? Or they save $10,000 on a house, that's like earning an extra 4 months worth of salary. Or it could just be, dealing with his or her spouse in a more successful way to make their lives easier, but not at the expense, of course, of the spouse. So honestly, I think my book does that. It provides the framework and the guidance for brand new negotiators, but also people who are skilled already or view themselves as skilled, because it will provide a lot of information and a lot of techniques that may not be within a skilled negotiator's repertoire already. People tend to get a little narrow in how they apply their negotiation skills, and my book provides some guidance for really anybody. But it's not about my book. If people don't want to buy my book, don't. I know Chris Voss has got a book called Never Split the Difference, and it's wildly popular. And while I really fundamentally disagree with the title of the book, Splitting the Difference is just a genius way to get what you want out of negotiation. But people love the book. I haven't read it yet. I bought it a couple of weeks ago and keep meaning to, just to see what he says about it. But while I disagree with his title, people love the book. The other thing is, we talked about getting to yes. People should definitely take a look at that. It's got some great insight with respect to BATNA and interest-based negotiations. A couple other books I'd recommend, and they're behavioral economic books, so not directly related to negotiation, although the insight there is, and the applicability of those insights is really amazing with respect to negotiation. There's Predictably Irrational by Dan Ariely, and another book called Nudge by, name escapes me at the moment, Richard Thaler. Sorry, I should have got that. I think he's a Nobel laureate now. So anyway, those are both amazing books that give insight into how the human mind works, and how at least you could apply those lessons to negotiations. I take some of the lessons from both those books and many others and put them in my book. But if you want some of the source material, take a look at those as well. So, and fundamentally, it comes down to this: is people should negotiate. It's not that hard to do. They should be brave enough to try, because even being a bad negotiator is better than not trying at all. You'll be wildly successful, and if you try and be good at it, you will be much more successful than almost anyone else, because really, almost no one tries. So my advice is try, be better, and you will be.
Definitely a lot of different and interesting books that I will have to check out, including Skill Negotiation. I really appreciate you being on the show today, James. A lot of very informative information, not only about negotiating, but communication, as well as the conceptual and psychological aspects involved with it. And I greatly appreciate you taking the time to sit down today and share a lot of those tidbits of information with my listeners.
That's great, Tesha. I really enjoyed it. I really appreciated the time. I appreciate the chance to share my insight. And again, I'm not asking people to buy my book. I think it's great, but what I do ask people is they try and be better negotiators, because it really will improve their lives. So just in immediate and dramatic ways. So whatever your listeners do, make an effort there, and it will matter.
Awesome. I'll definitely be checking out your book. Hopefully my listeners will take a look at it as well. I will be providing a couple of links in the summary page for the episode. Thanks again. Thanks again, everyone, for tuning into this episode. I hope you all enjoyed it just as much as I did. As part of today's show, I would like to do the first giveaway of many. And for this one, I'll be giving away a copy of James Johnson's book, Skill Negotiation, to one lucky person. For a chance to win a copy of Skill Negotiation, follow me on Instagram at All Things Interesting, subscribe to my YouTube channel, All Things Interesting Podcast, and drop a comment as to what you think is the best skill to have in any negotiation, as well as your thoughts on the show, whether you liked it or not, or if you have any feedback for future episodes. And before we close things off, I just wanted to say a big thank you to all my listeners. I really appreciate everybody tuning in over these past few months. The reception has been absolutely amazing, just to see how many people have not only subscribed to the show, but have listened to it and have provided feedback that has helped the show continue to grow as much as it did. So thanks again, and keep an eye out for new episodes of the All Things Interesting podcast.